How do we celebrate New Year's?
By staying up all night long. And we get sparkling cider. Some people stay up till midnight. I fell asleep a lot.
And what happens at midnight?
The ball in New York City drops. Everybody's happy. You celebrate. It's weird when we have to, KISS. Yes. Gross.
What are your New Year's resolutions?
Have sweets all the time.
A backflip. Change my name to Sparkly.
Every week, a movie night, a game night, and a Gilligan's Island night. Have lots of time with my grandparents. I would like to try wasabi.
I like to get a unicorn and bunnies.
What's the thing you want to do most with your life?
Want to be an NFL kicker, be the best cellist in the world, and be the best Lego builder in the world.
Going to all the continents.
A missionary.
And when I ride a deer.
Pharmaceutical rep, because that's what my dad does. Have like cool bedroom with like cool posters and a hot tub and a ladder in my closet and have like a secret lab.
I want to get married to Kian. It would be a pony wedding with lots of ponies and have twin girls, Maddie and Madison.
Why is it not good to give up?
Then you'll never achieve what you could. Even if you have some rough times, you don't give up. You keep going.
Someday you will get it. Don't ever say you can't get it.
If you give up, you might be missing out because one day you will get it. And it will be really awesome when you do.
How can you help someone to not give up?
Encouraging them, giving them advices for stuff.
Say, you're doing a good job. I like to hug people and kiss them. And I'll give them a toy.
Then I'll say, I'll be your best friend. So come on, since I can do it, then I will teach you how to do it.
Why does God change us?
Because he loves us. He loves us so much.
He knows that we need to be changed sometimes, and he wants us to have a better life. He doesn't want us to be lost. He wants us to come home to him.
How does God change us?
Puts all the good things in our hearts. He changes us by giving us something to believe in.
Why is it important to give someone a second chance?
When you're giving someone a second chance, you're trusting them and believing in them.
So that we're not caught up on something that we've done. We can't really move on.
To have a new beginning.
What would you tell someone who didn't believe God could change them?
That Jesus died on the cross for our sins.
And he can change you because he's Jesus. Keep praying and he will change you. You will feel it. Because you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you.
Happy New Year!
Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
And Happy New Year. How do you feel about the word excellence? It's kind of an elusive word because in one sense it signifies our best. It's what we're capable of and what we want to strive to achieve. It's a good word. But in another sense it condemns because there's always more to do and there's always more to prove and more to improve. There's always more to accomplish. Maybe another question that some of us have struggled with this is excellence even worth it? Is excellence worth it? I mean, you can't be excellent in everything. You don't need to be perfect in everything, do you? There's a difference between framing a house and building a grand piano, right? Had a guy several years ago teach me how to frame and went through the whole process of carpentry, all right? Like he was this carpenter and taught me how to frame a house, how to throw up the drywall, all those kinds of things. And he had this philosophy of carpentry. His philosophy was this: carpentry is 90% covering up your mistakes from the previous step. And this guy was like a squirrel. Like he moved at a speed and a pace because that's what he did. He did everything as quickly as he possibly could. And if you messed up, it's okay. Don't worry about it. You're going to fix it here in a minute anyway. And that kind of makes sense to me, right? But that doesn't work if you're trying to build a grand piano, does it? It doesn't work. It requires something more precise, something that needs beauty. It requires more perfection. It requires more excellence. So when you think of the word excellence, what do you think? Do you see the word as something you're comfortable with, or is it one that creates anxiety or panic within you? Is excellence a part of your life? And maybe even more importantly, do you want excellence to be a part of your life? When I was in ninth grade, I was taking a French class in school. My mom one day got a call from my teacher telling her that I was in great danger of failing this French class. My mom at the time was a bookkeeper, kind of an accountant, and she was doing some side work for a doctor who just so happened to be married to a lady who taught French at a private school. And so my mom traded her extra work for a couple tutoring sessions with this French teacher from a different school. And so I sat down with her a couple times. We go through all the stuff. At the end of it all, she goes back to my mom and she's like, I don't know what his problem is because he knows French. Everything we're doing, he knows the words, he understands what he's doing, he understands how we're talking. I don't know why he's failing the class. So my mom goes back then to my teacher and asks why he's been about to fail. And it turns out, oh, well, he's not turning in his work. Which completely changes the conversation, doesn't it? My mom realized that I had not been doing my best. I wasn't pursuing excellence. This past week I heard the story of an old U.S. Navy admiral whose last name was Rickover. He was in charge of the nuclear navy, and if you were an officer wanting to serve on a nuclear submarine, then you had to be interviewed and approved by Admiral Rickover. And his interviews had a reputation of being pretty difficult, terrifying, intimidating. The kinds of things that when you walked out afterwards, guys would be fairly emotionally about. And I heard this story partly because of President Jimmy Carter, who we've been celebrating this last week in his passing. Carter, early on in his life, long before he was president, he wanted to work on a nuclear submarine. And so he had to endure an interview process with Admiral Rickover. And here's what Carter writes about that encounter in his own words. He says, I'd applied to the nuclear submarine program, and Admiral Rickover was interviewing me for the job. It was the first time I'd met him, and we sat in a large room by ourselves for more than 2 hours. He let me choose the subjects I wished to discuss, so very carefully I chose those about which I knew most at that time. Current events, gunmanship, music, literature, naval tactics, electronics, gunnery. He began to ask me a series of questions of increasing difficulty, and in each instance he soon proved that I knew relatively little about the subject I had chosen. He always looked right into my eyes. He never smiled, and I was saturated in a cold sweat. Finally, he asked me a question I thought I could redeem myself with. He said, how did you stand in your class at the Naval Academy? Well, since I had completed my sophomore year at Georgia Tech before entering Annapolis, I had done very well. I swelled my chest with pride and answered, Sir, I stood 59th in a class of 820. I sat back, waiting for his congratulations, which never came. Instead, he asked me this question, did you do your best? I started to say yes, sir, but I remembered who this was, and I recalled several times at the academy when I could have learned more about our allies or our enemies, our weapons, our strategy, so forth. And so I finally gulped and I said, no, sir, I didn't always do my best. He looked at me for a long time, and then he turned his chair around to end the interview. He asked one final question, one I've never been able to forget or answer. He said, why not? I sat there for a while, shaken, and then slowly left the room. What about you? Is excellence a part of your life, your work, your relationships, your marriage, your kids, your friends? And what about your relationship with God? Do you put forth your best effort? Have you done your best? Do you even want to do your best? And if not, why not? Why not? That's the question that exposes us, isn't it? It's the question that exposes our excuses and the darkness of our own hearts. Why do we not do our best? Well, it's because we're too lazy or we're too selfish. Maybe we bury our heads in the sand and ignore all the potential consequences. I mean, we can go on and on. We've been doing this series, New Year, New You. We've started out this first 2 weeks talking about reading the Bible, very practical ways for us to be able to grow. For the next 2 weeks, today and then next week, we're going to talk about pursuing excellence in our worship. Because there are real implications when we give less than our best. If we give less than our best in our marriage or our work or our extra responsibilities, well, then you could lose your job. You could lose your wife and your kids or your friends, right? But when we don't give our best to God, we don't feel the same impending consequences. But we should, because there's something on the line here. Colossians 3:17 is a foundational verse that we're going to be looking at a whole lot more next week, but we're going to introduce it briefly here. He says, whatever you do, whether in word or in deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. He says, whatever you do. Whatever you do. That includes everything. It includes every place that you go and every person you talk to, every task you take on. And it's not a call for you to do your best. Paul, who writes this, actually takes it a step further. He says that you do it in the name of Jesus. So this means that the places we go and the people we talk to and the tasks that we take on are all opportunities to represent Jesus, to give effort to Jesus, to bring honor to Jesus. They're all opportunities for us to worship Jesus. So are you living for Jesus with excellence? Are you worshiping Jesus with excellence? And how does God feel if we don't worship with our best? What happens if we give less than our best? And what is it that God expects from us? Let's do a little bit of a history lesson. In your Old Testament, at the end, you're going to find a book called Malachi. Malachi was written at a very specific time to a very specific people for a very specific purpose. Long before Malachi was written, there was a nation of Israel. Saul was the first king, followed by David and then Solomon. And then there was a fourth, a guy named Rehoboam, who was son of Solomon. And when he takes over as king, he immediately decides that he's going to be heavy-handed, that he actually wants to be burdensome on his people because he thought that it would bring him respect. Instead, he created a civil war, and the nation splits. So the nation of Israel, which was made up of 12 different tribes, split into 2 nations. 10 tribes, the ones to the north, broke off, and they form a new nation while they keep the same name, Israel. The 2 tribes to the south form a new nation that's now called Judah. Now, the northern kingdom of Israel ended up having 19 kings over its lifespan, and every single one of them was trash. I don't use that word lightly, all right? And I'm not trying to overstate it. They were horrible kings. The Bible tells us they were horrible kings. Not one of them was a good king because not one of them sought the Lord. Every single one of them led the people further away from God. And eventually we're told that God allowed the Assyrians to come in and absolutely destroy the nation. Nothing was left. Judah, to the south, was a little bit different. Not much, but a little. They end up having 20 kings over their years. 5 of their kings sought the Lord. 5 kings helped draw people toward God instead of dragging them away. But by and large, this nation still strayed from God. And eventually God hands them over to Babylon, which invades and destroys Jerusalem and takes a large number of Jewish people into captivity. Years later, a Persian king will allow a small number of them, around 50,000, what we would call a remnant. He allows a remnant to return to Jerusalem. It's an incredible act of grace and kindness. And they kind of rebuild. Not really. I mean, they didn't do their best, and they certainly didn't finish the job. And so in your Old Testament, you might come across a book called Nehemiah. If you've ever read it, it's about a guy who felt a calling from God to finish this work. He had a vision from God to come and finish building the walls of Jerusalem, making it a safe and a secure place to live. And that's exactly what he set out to do. He was given permission to complete the job somewhere around 70 years after that remnant had first returned. But even so, as Nehemiah works with this remnant of people in Jerusalem, they were a difficult people to work with. They'd kind of rebuilt the temple, but they weren't paying attention to upkeep. They certainly weren't taking care of it well. They weren't living their best by any stretch of the imagination when it came to their relationship with God. In fact, they proved to be just as unfaithful to God as their ancestors. We're told that all of their behavior had led to poverty and injustice within the city. They were largely an awful people, just like their ancestors. And that's when Malachi writes his words. He's a prophet. God gives him this message to deliver to the people. And early on in the book of Malachi, the basic message is this: your worship is a joke. That's the message. You aren't worshiping with excellence. You aren't worshiping with your best. In fact, it looks like the opposite. It looks like you're trying to do as little as possible. You're just trying to get by. Somehow you just want to appease God enough to keep him somewhat happy and out of your life. This isn't about Israel. This is about us. We do this too. It's a guy named George Barna. He's a church research guy. He calls this casual Christianity. Now, one of the ways that the Jewish people would worship was through sacrifices. They would go into the temple once a year and they would offer an animal sacrifice for their sin. That's how they made themselves right with God. That's how their sins would be forgiven. And they had instructions and expectations for what that would look like. They were told to bring the best of their flock and offer it as a sacrifice to the Lord. The best of their flock. God wanted their best. It was supposed to be an animal that was healthy. It was supposed to be spotless with no markings that made it look tainted, right? Nothing about the animal was supposed to be imperfect. In fact, if it was the animal from your flock that you would have wanted to breed because you would have wanted more animals just like it. It was the one that you would take to the county fair for the blue ribbon. It was the one that you could make the most money from if you kept it for yourself. God says that's the one. That's the one that he deserves. Because he says he's worth it. God says he deserves the best. But the people that Malachi is writing to had settled for something much less than that. Malachi 1:6, God speaks to the people through Malachi, and he says, a son honors his father, and a slave honors his master. If I'm a father, where's the honor due me? If I'm a master, where's the respect due me? He says he deserves something. He has worth, and he deserves to receive his worth, his worship. God is asking them, why am I not getting what I deserve? That question may sting us a little bit as well. And then God starts pointing fingers. He says, it's you, priests. It's you who show contempt for my name. Contempt, we don't use that word a whole lot. It just means a feeling of disdain or disrespect. It can even talk about disobedience. He's saying, you priests, you don't respect me. You don't obey me. The priests would have heard that and they would have responded. In Malachi's words, he's responding for them. They're like, wait, what do you mean? How have we shown contempt for your name? The priests who are ensuring that God receives what he deserves are the ones giving him disrespect and disobedience, but they don't know how. So in verse 7, God says, by offering defiled food on my altar. They've been giving defiled sacrifices to God. And you'd think that the priest, so they say, how have we defiled you, God? And God says, by saying that the Lord's table is contemptible. The priests are acting like the altars on the sacrifices on the altar are not worthy of respect. And God says, you do this when you offer blind animals for sacrifice. Is that not wrong? When you sacrifice crippled or diseased animals, is that not wrong? Instead of bringing the blue ribbon winner as a sacrifice to God, they're bringing in the runts of the litters. The people are offering sacrifices of weak animals, the ones that, may not even survive the winter anyway. It's like regifting at Christmas. Surely none of you do that, right? You know, you get that gift and it costs you nothing, but you're not going to use it. You're not going to keep it. You're going to give it to Goodwill. But then you realize, I have to get something for my friend. And so you're like, oh, I'll just give it to them and it fulfills my duty, right? That's what they're doing to God. They're giving him the sheep that are like frail and old, about to die, the ones that they've already got everything out of, or the one that's not going to bring any value to them at all anyways. They were just going to let it die in the cold this winter. Why don't we just give it to God? And God's like, oh man, you make me feel so nice. They're giving God what he calls defiled food. It's like those leftovers in your fridge that are still there from Christmas. And you know you need to throw them away, but you haven't got to it yet, right? And then someone shows up at your house and you realize, well, they need to eat. And you just kind of like cross your fingers and give it to them, right? Their worship is so very far from true worship. It's actually sin. The people are sinning by offering less than their best. And the priest sins by accepting it. They aren't bringing the sacrifice, but they are the ones who are accepting the sacrifices. They're the gatekeepers, the ones who are supposed to ensure the people are honoring God. They're supposed to lead the people toward God. And instead, the people are bringing these cruddy, insignificant gifts to God, and the priests decide, oh, that's good enough, and they go along with it. They're complicit in it, participating in the defiling of God. God goes further. Try offering these things to your governor. Would he be pleased with you? Would he accept you? And what God's saying is you wouldn't accept this gift for yourself. You wouldn't want less than the best for yourself. Why are you bringing it to me? You wouldn't give it to a distinguished guest if they showed up. Meanwhile, we're just throwing trash at God. I mean that. And it's a really big deal to him. Not because he's greedy, not because God has got some sort of an attitude issue where he just needs people to praise him, but because it reveals something wrong with us. Our worship is a window to our hearts. When we feed God trash, it looks like we've got a lot of trash in our hearts. God goes on, verse 10. This is fascinating. Oh, that one of you would shut the temple doors so you would not light useless fires on my altar. God's not even asking the priests to offer good sacrifices. He's begging one of them to shut the doors. He's begging someone to make a stand. Jordan talked about this earlier. As a church, we don't cancel services. We experienced last week one of the good reasons why maybe we should, right? But we're open about this. We're very clear. We understand that sometimes people can't get here. That's fine. That doesn't mean that no one can get here. And it doesn't mean that we're going to turn down the opportunity for people to worship God. But can you imagine arriving one Sunday and seeing chains and locks on the doors, preventing anyone from coming into worship? Imagine if Doc or I stood on the other side and told you your worship has been less than honorable to God and we're not going to allow it anymore. Can you imagine? A situation where the honorable thing to do would be to close our doors, not because of fear of weather, not because of fear of people's opinions, but because we fear our God. And then verse 14, God says, cursed is the cheat. That's how God views this. Cursed is the cheat who has an acceptable male in his flock and vows to give it, but then sacrifices a blemished animal to the Lord. Because I'm a great king, and my name is to be feared among the nations. Now, we don't offer sacrifices like this, do we? We don't have sheep that we're bringing in, but it is worth asking, are you giving God your best, or are you coasting? And should we, as pastors, shut the temple door, as it were? And we struggle with this. Because we don't usually ask, what's the best I can do, or what would it look like for me to serve with excellence? Instead, we ask, what's the least I have to do? I mentioned George Barna earlier in Casual Christianity. According to him, he says it's for those who want to experience the best of both worlds. They want to feel like they're better people than if they had been irreligious, but it's not a faith into which they feel compelled to heavily invest themselves in. And the scary thing about that is that according to Barna, casual Christians make up about 66% of our churches because we're way too comfortable giving our least. We give our least to other important things that deserve our excellence. Oftentimes, someone gets fired because they aren't giving their best at work. Someone's marriage falls apart because one or both parents or partners aren't giving their best. Oftentimes, rifts between parents and children take place because the parents refuse to give their best efforts. But it's seldom vocalized, right? Can you imagine if it were? Imagine if you went to work tomorrow and you asked, instead of just getting fired, you asked your boss, what's the least I have to do to keep my job? Even worse, imagine going home today to your spouse, sitting across the table, looking at them and saying, hey, what's the least I have to do to keep you from divorcing me? Imagine being in the hospital after the birth of your first child and you look at the nurse and you say, what's the least I have to do to keep this child alive? What's the least I have to do to fulfill my role as a parent? And you and I both know that a lot of people actually live that way. They just don't vocalize it, right? In fact, that's why New Year's resolutions exist. Because we know that we don't consistently give our best. I saw this shirt this past week. It asks, am I perfect? No. But am I trying to be a better person? Also no. That's how we live, isn't it? That's normal. But it isn't healthy. It's absolutely not anything near what God deserves. And since we're imagining things, imagine if our God had the same attitude. What if our God had said, what's the least I can do while I create the world? Can you imagine if God had looked at us and said, what's the least I can do to let creation know that I care? What's the least I can do to help humanity? What's the least I can do when it comes to forgiveness or grace? I promise you this, God becoming man was nowhere near the least that he could do. I think it was him at his best. God becoming man was God accomplishing excellence in the same way that he made the mountains and the beaches and the sunsets. So can you see why this would be so upsetting to God? God has given us excellence, and we respond with as little as possible. Are you willing to give God what he deserves? Are you willing to worship him with your best, or are you content with just getting by? Guys, God isn't looking for excellence the way that we usually define it. He's looking for whether we're giving our best, our version of excellence. It's the same question that Rickover asked Carter. Did you do your best? And it would be the same thing if we were being interviewed by God. He could look at us and ask, have you given your best? And if not, why not? Let me show you just one real quick way that this plays out. I'll have some more later on. I'm going to come back up at the end of the service, but we're going to start here. Just one simple, practical thing for us to consider. In the New Testament church, which certainly would include us, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 11, he says, in the following directives, I have no praise for you, for your meetings do more harm than good. That's the priest shutting the temple door kind of a situation, right? He says, in the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and to some extent, I believe it. So then, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat. Listen, church. We're giving our less than best when our worship to God is in conflict with the ways that we treat each other. When we dig into the same plate together and then we disrespect each other in how we speak or what we post on social media, it makes the Lord's Supper look like tainted sheep. It looks like offering blind sheep and sick lambs. And so I want to invite you to the tables. The Lord's Supper is just one of the ways that we worship, but I'm also going to give you an out. Don't come to these tables unless you're prepared to give your best. If you come to the tables, I think you need to be ready to turn your heart toward God. And so you're going to take a little bit of bread and a little bit of juice, and it's going to be a way to remember what Christ has done for us. That time when he gave his absolute best. And maybe you've participated in the Lord's Supper thousands of times. Maybe it's old hat for you. Maybe you haven't taken this moment seriously. Maybe you've been to church without actually being at church. You know what I'm talking about? When you're physically here, but you're not really mentally or spiritually present. I want to challenge you this morning to actually worship God, starting now. That in this time, Lord's Supper, that you would begin worshiping God now. And as we move into a time of song, worshiping through music, I want you to give your best to God. Give him your attention in a real way. For just a few moments this morning, can you give God your best? Because he deserves it. There's other ways that we worship at these tables. There's a box designed for giving. If you're part of the Cap City family, when you give, are you giving your best? Are you honoring him? Are you prepared to give, maybe even sacrificially, above and beyond? That's what our generous buckets are for. Guys, I want to challenge you. I want you to worship with me. Let's worship. But when we worship, let's worship in a way that our God deserves. It's going to require you to lock in. It's going to require you to focus in, to give God your best if you're willing, starting now. And so if you're willing, would you join me at the tables? All right, we got a couple more comments here, all right? Just to wrap this up. New year, new you. I want to offer some resolutions that I think could help change your life. It would especially change your life when it comes to what it looks like when you worship God. So what if we stopped asking what's the least I have to do, and we started asking what does it look like to worship with excellence? What does my best look like? Let me lay out some different places where you may be right now, some challenges that you could strive for depending on where you're at in your life. I wanted to kind of stagger out some different challenges here based on where you may be, somewhat like what we've done with this Bible reading plan, just to encourage you to take your next step. So for some of us, it may mean just show up. Could you make a commitment to just show up and worship on a regular basis, at least more frequently than you do normally? What if you prioritized attendance more consistently? So maybe you attend once a month. What would it look like if you doubled that and attended twice a month? Or maybe you do attend twice. What would it look like if you were here 75% of the time? Or maybe you got plugged into something deeper like a life group or a growth class. How might that impact your worship? What would that look like in terms of giving your best to God? To just push yourself to take a step further. But we don't really want you to just be here, just show up. We want to challenge you to participate. That would be the next level, maybe some of you need to be challenged with, to participate in worship. Because the reality is that sometimes we can come to church and we can sit through an entire service and not actually be here. That physically we can be here, but just mentally, spiritually, somewhere very far from here. All the different things that we can be concerned about. And so it might look like praying when someone on stage is leading us in prayer, as opposed to all the other things that our minds go to. It may look like participating in songs, not just having songs happen around you, but to have them happen in you. It might be worshiping before you even get to church. That's kind of a wild idea, right? What if you began worshiping before you got here? What if on your way you could maybe sing some songs in the car? Maybe it was quiet prayer or some meditation, maybe even a discussion with your family. All for the purpose of setting your heart right, so that when you arrive and you're in this place, you're prepared to worship. That would be next level worship, wouldn't it? And what if you went even further? What if you took worship home? What if you took a morning a week, maybe an evening in the week, and you intentionally worshiped however it is that God leads you, whether maybe it's through song, maybe it's through prayer, maybe it's through some time of meditation or conversation with someone else. What if you made space for God? Even more so than just a Sunday morning, just leaving it here until you pick it back up next week. So instead of living a life where you show up with your blind lambs, crippled lambs, your diseased lambs, what if you actually started giving God your very best? Now, this is just a part one sermon. We're going to get into this a lot more next week. We're going to dive in deeper on a lot more practical aspects of worship, not just things that happen on a Sunday morning, but what it looks like to give God your best throughout your life. And I think that's going to be a good, valuable thing for you. So I want you to know I'm grateful that you're here. I'm grateful that you choose to be here with us on this particular day and any other time that you join us. I want to let you know that we're done. All right, the service is done. You are welcome to stick around because we have another song. And I hope that as we've talked about worship this morning, that you would feel compelled to worship God now. But I hope that you've worshiped God before we see you again. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next time.